the ascending and descending tracts of the spinal cord. Then we'll finish by talking in this chapter about the reflexes that the spinal cord manages and handles. Those are kind of the three major parts of the chapter. So the spinal cord begins officially at the big hole. That's the term, foramen magnum, the hole that is big, the large hole in the base of the skull. And it begins there and goes all the way down to about lumbar 1 vertebra. And as we're going to see, that's kind of an interesting place for it to stop. It actually stops a lot higher up than a lot of people think it does. So the spinal cord doesn't go quite down as far, and that has some important implications, side effects for us clinically, that the spinal cord stops so high up. The space that it is located in is the vertebral foramina of the vertebrae. So you might recall that if we look at a vertebra from the top down, it's got this kind of spinous process, these transverse processes. This part of the vertebra is called the body. There. And it's got this structure right here, like that, these processes that stick out, transverse processes and spinous processes there. And the spinal cord, this is looking at it from the top down, the spinal cord exists within this space right here called the vertebral foramen. And each one of those stacked together makes this kind of vertebral column. And it is surrounded and protected by the same three layers of the meninges that we talked about with the brain too. So here's another version down here of a much better diagram. That vertebral body, can't really see the whole thing in this diagram, but like my little tiny picture. But there's that space there called the vertebral foramen, and that's where the spinal cord is located. But in reality, it doesn't just kind of float in that space. It's actually pretty well packed in. So this thing with that little butterfly shape in the middle this is the spinal cord. That's the gray matter of the spinal cord, and the lighter is the white matter of the spinal cord, and this is really the posterior side of it over here. And then that little layer right there on the surface of the spinal cord is the pia. That's the pia mater. Then there's the subarachnoid space where cerebrospinal fluid would be found. Talked about that last week. And then the arachnoid mater and the dura mater, which is kind of pictured in blue right here. It's not really very blue, but it totally covers the entire spinal cord and kind of covers these spinal roots too. And then outside of that is this bit of epidural space that contains adipose tissue in that epidural space. So an epidural, as many of you are aware, is delivering anesthesia into this epidural space, and it mostly just affects the spinal nerves outside the spinal cord without anesthetizing the spinal cord too much, because you put the epidural, the needle goes in, and it doesn't actually puncture the dura like you would if you were going to withdraw cerebrospinal fluid. You'd need the needle to actually go through the dura into this space down here to pull cerebrospinal fluid out. But if you're just delivering anesthesia into the epidural space, it just kind of goes into the fat tissue, but it doesn't affect the spinal cord, but it can affect sensation and movement with these spinal nerves that come out of the spinal cord. So those are the three layers that surround the spinal cord. Those are kind of the 1, 2, 3 listed there on page 167, but that's a review from what we talked about with the spinal cord. But from superficial to deep, it would be the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. And those three layers from superficial to deep. Right, the pia is the one that's right on the surface of the spinal cord. There they are listed right there in your textbook. All right, and they cover and protect the spinal cord, but also contain the cerebrospinal fluid. So does CSF surround the spinal cord? Yes, all the way down. It completely surrounds the spinal cord. All right, so the spinal cord, in much the same way, is protected in the same way that the brain is. Now, at the top of the next page on 168, it kind of says, although the spinal cord ends at L1, the dura mater and arachnoid continue to S2. Why is that significant? All right, well, you can see a bit of that. I'm going to try to answer that question for you. You may have it already answered, but if we look at this, this is kind of a schematic diagram in the way upper right-hand corner of the spine. These are your vertebral bodies right here. So this is about L1. Let me put some labels on them for you guys. See if these show up okay. I know it's kind of a small diagram. This is L1. This would be T12, T11. All right, so this is L2, L3, and so on. The spinal cord actually ends, the official end of the spinal cord is known as conus medullaris. Conus medullaris, it's the official end of the spinal cord. And the pia sticks to the surface of the end of the spinal cord, but the dura and the arachnoid continue on down. Now we're going to have to look really closely at this diagram from your textbook down here. But you can see the dura mater labeled right down here, and the arachnoid is kind of pink. And they're continuing all the way down. And these are some spinal nerves, this stuff that kind of looks like yellow cables and green cables. Those are various spinal nerves, but there's no spinal cord. Because see, I don't know if this, sorry if this is not big enough. That's L4. I'll make it look a little bigger. This is L4. So we are we're looking at an image that's way down here, like right around in this area right there, L4. So we're in the back, well below the end of the spinal cord. Therefore, now we're kind of flipping it back around. This is the front and the back. So over here is coming from the posterior side. So there's a way that we can actually stick a needle in through the back. Now this would actually puncture the dura mater. All right, so you can see kind of right, try to draw your attention to it so you guys can see what I'm pointing to. Right about there, the needle punches through the dura and the arachnoid. The dura is thicker. It's a dense, irregular connective tissue. The arachnoid is much thinner. But this is how we do what's known as a, well, what is this? You tell me. If you're familiar, if you guys are familiar with this procedure, what is the procedure that's being illustrated here? To put a needle into that vertebral column, no, the epidural would be outside the dura. Outside the dura. That's what I was showing you guys on this page over here. The epidura would be out here. This, what I'm showing you on the next page, has the needle actually, let's see if I can show it in a color that'll sort of stand out, that will actually puncture through the dura and go into this space to remove cerebrospinal fluid. Yeah, it's referred to as a lumbar puncture. Some people call it a spinal tap. Spinal tap. But it's called a lumbar puncture, and is probably most commonly done to withdraw cerebrospinal fluid out and pull CSF out into the syringe send it for lab tests. Yeah, so that is the kind of the long answer to the question at the top of page 168. Why is it significant that the spinal cord ends, let's see if I can put it on this diagram, about where the spinal cord would come to an end. It's kind of this cone shape, that's why it's called conus. So this would be the end of the spinal cord, and it just goes on up right there, spinal cord, and it ends right there. It has anchoring ligaments called filum terminale and other spinal nerves that continue on down, but it has ended right there, and we can stick a needle in there to withdraw cerebrospinal fluid, but don't have the risk of potentially putting the needle into the spinal cord and potentially damaging the spinal cord. So the clinical significance is that it allows us to withdraw. It's an easy way to withdraw cerebrospinal fluid, to do what's called a lumbar puncture. So like I said, the conus medullaris is that cone-shaped end of the spinal cord. You can also see it kind of labeled right over here. It's just the cone-shaped area at the end of the spinal cord. And the pia mater continues on down as this structure called the filum terminale, which is the end of it just kind of comes off the very tip. Kind of draw it maybe in a bright red color on my drawing, right off the very tip of the cone. And it might not go in the right way. Off the tip of the cone. And it goes all the way down and anchors the spinal cord all the way down at the base of the vertebral canal. So it comes off the end of the spinal cord and goes all the way down here to the subarachnoid space, right down at the very, very tip of the sacral canal, of the sacral bone, the sacrum. And it just anchors, that filum terminale helps to anchor the spinal cord in place. These are mixed nerves, all of the nerves that come out of the spinal cord. There are 31 pairs. What does that mean to call them mixed nerves? Based on what we talked about last week, remember when we talked about the cranial nerves last week? And we had that column with the cranial nerves that was S, M, B, and the S and the M stood for the fact that those nerves were either what or what? Yeah, motor or sensory, but calling them mixed nerves means that they're both afferent, and like this nerve contains both afferent nerve fibers and efferent nerve fibers. They contain both sensory and motor. So, and that's true of all 31 pairs of spinal nerves. This is different from the cranial nerves where some are purely sensory, some are mostly sensory, some are completely motor, some of them are mixed, some of them are both. All 31 pairs of spinal nerves are both, contain both, input and output. The spinal cord is a little bit larger in the cervical region and larger in the lumbar region, mostly because it contains more cell bodies for motor neurons, contains a lot more cell bodies of motor neurons for the upper and lower appendages. The cervical enlargement has more cell bodies, we call them soma, more cell bodies of motor neurons to upper limbs. Okay? And the same is true of that lumbar enlargement. The lumbar enlargement is because it contains more cell bodies of motor neurons to the lower limbs. And that's why the spinal cord has this kind of a sort of a funky shape, kind of a weird shape. Let's see if I can find a place to sort of draw my sketch of it. Hopefully it looks okay. Kind of right in the middle. Where the spinal cord begins, it would actually kind of be a little bit wider, and then it's sort of tubular in the thoracic region, and then it, gets wider again. Not like that. I don't even know what this is going to look like. That's a highly enhanced view. So this would be your skull right up here, and that's foramen magnum right there where the spinal cord officially begins. And then this is the conus medullaris right down there and the filum terminale that hangs off the end of it. But this is the cervical enlargement where the spinal cord is actually wider in your neck region, and this is the lumbar enlargement where it's actually wider in that lumbar region. And that's because it has cell bodies packed in here, just draw them as little dots, trying to anyway, of all the axons that go out to your various different muscles of your upper limbs. Oh man, you guys forgive my terrible artwork. And the lumbar enlargement has the ones that go to your lower limbs. Okay, so these go all the way down to your feet. Oh my gosh, that's terrible. That's so tragic. I just try. And then all of the nerves that are still contained in the vertebral canal. Yeah, it's art, which means you can have any opinion of it you want. All of these spinal nerves in the vertebral canal, below the end of the spinal cord, they all kind of bundle together. And somebody looked at it and said, it sort of looks like all of these nerves in the spinal canal, in the vertebral canal, that are inferior to or beyond the end of the spinal cord, how they bundle together like this. They kind of look like, for lack of a better word, it makes it look like the spinal cord has a ponytail. Looks like the spinal cord has a ponytail coming off the end of it. And somebody said, yeah, let's call it that. Let's call it the ponytail. That's what it means. Horse tail. And the horse tail isn't a horse tail. It's just the name for all of those nerves that extend beyond the end of the spinal cord but are still in the vertebral canal. They haven't quite come out yet. They will. They emerge. You can see in this schematic up here, they will emerge out of that space and head out to innervate the tissues that they are responsible for. But for a while, they travel beyond the end of the spinal cord there. Okay? So that was looking at the spinal cord kind of from the front back. Let's take a look at a cross section of the spinal cord. So this is the image that you got on page 168. And I'm just going to use those bold-faced terms right there under the heading cross-sectional anatomy of the spinal cord. You guys can see that. I'm going to use those terms and label my diagram here. And if you've done it already, great. Just, use my diagram to check your work. And if not, feel free to label right along. So first thing that we see is this, before I draw on it, I'll just kind of point it out. The first thing you see is this butterfly pattern in the middle, sort of. I don't know what it looks like. It kind of looks like a butterfly pattern to me. I always thought it looked like the Wu-Tang symbol too. I don't know if that means anything to anybody, but I was like, oh, butterfly. No, I was like, it looks like Wu-Tang. But anyway, forever, right? So that is the gray matter. This is the gray matter of the spinal cord. Now remember, what is gray matter? What's different gray matter from white matter? I always work it backwards. I go, okay, what makes white matter white? White matter's white because of what? Because of what? Somebody tell me, type it in. What makes white matter white? It's not really white, it's just light tan. Myelin, yeah, myelination. And remember, and Dongsil, you already kind of, you know how I'm going to ask. So Dongsil went ahead and kind of typed my follow-up question. What's the part that's myelinated? It's just the axons. Thank you. So when you see white matter in the central nervous system, brain or spinal cord, you're mostly looking at axons. Now in this picture, the axons are coming at you. We're looking at a cross-section of the spinal cord. If I go back to this previous picture here, way up here in the way upper right, we kind of do a cross-section right through there, and then we kind of tip it up on its side so we can see the spinal cord. This is the view from your textbook, right? Down here, that's the view from the textbook. And there's the white matter, and here's the gray matter. And the white matter is lighter because of myelin, and the only parts that are myelinated are axons. So what you see here in this cross section, if you looked at it under the microscope, it would just under the microscope, you'd mostly just see these little circles. They'd look like little donuts almost. Let's see if I can draw some little dots in the middle. I'll enhance it because this is what it looks like under the microscope. It's just, and they're just packed. They're packed like this, like that. And so what you'd see under the microscope, you're looking at the axon. You're looking at a cross section of the axon surrounded by a Schwann cell, surrounded by its myelin sheath. And that's all you're seeing. You're just like, you're looking at them end on. Okay? So that is the white matter. But the gray matter consists of unmyelinated parts of neurons, which would be the soma and the dendrites. There are axons in the gray matter because there's things that are coming and going. But it's a little darker because it's not solid axons. Right? And there are patterns to this gray matter. Let's put some directions on here. This is posterior. So this would be towards the back. This is anterior. All right. So these kinds of lumps right here, this whole part right there, that whole lump, for lack of a better word, is the anterior gray horn. And this little skinny one back here, that little skinny part right there, is the posterior gray horn. Oops, there we go. And in some places of the spinal cord, not in this diagram, but in some locations in the spinal cord, there's also another little lump right here called the lateral gray horn. There's an extra little piece of gray matter that kind of sticks out, and that's our one called the lateral gray horn. Gray horn, okay? But it's only located in the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. It's not located in the cervical or the sacral part of the spinal cord. This picture back here, let me go backwards again. The diagram from your textbook has a lateral gray horn. Okay. Now this one's flipped around from the direction of the one in our textbook. It's got anterior towards the top, so this is looking towards the front. So this would be the anterior gray horn. This little skinnier one back here would be the posterior gray horn, and these little bumps on either side are the lateral gray horn. Okay? All right, and that's that. So those are the different parts of the gray matter, and then the rest is kind of white matter, and it's organized into, I got to write my directions again. This is posterior towards the back. This is anterior towards the front. So the white matter is grouped into areas called columns. So these are the posterior columns, the anterior columns. I'll just put AC, anterior columns, on either side of this anterior median fissure. That's what that thing is right there, that little split right there. That little crack is the anterior median fissure. Anterior median fissure. These over here would be the lateral columns. Lateral columns there on either side. There's also a little split on the back side. It just shows as a little bit of an indention on the posterior side, but it might actually be a little bit longer. On some people's spinal cords, it may be a little bit deeper. That's called the posterior median sulcus. Right there, that little depression. And like I said, I didn't aim very well. And it may go a little bit deeper, but it's definitely not as wide open as the anterior median fissure. And so that's one of the ways you can kind of always tell if you're looking at a cross section. maybe in lab, if you're looking at a cross section in lab, you can tell the anterior side usually has a little bit more of a wide space. That anterior median fissure is wider and the part in the back is tighter, so that's why it's called a sulcus. The only other part I think to list that I didn't put is this little hole in the middle. I'm just going to kind of fill it in right there. That is the central canal. What would we find in that central canal? What would be found in the central canal? What's found in there? CSF, yeah, CSF, cerebrospinal fluid. Yeah, it's an open canal that's got cerebrospinal fluid. Reviewing a little bit from previous chapter, the chapter on neuroglia. I'll give you a second to think about it. What are the cells, the glial cells, the neuroglial cells that make and secrete and circulate the CSF? If you look at under the microscope, at a cross section of this central canal, kind of do this like this. Let's zoom in here. Let's do a microscope view of that central canal. And if we look at the central canal, right along the edge, we would see these cells. What are the cells that line the ventricles and spaces of the central nervous system? And they make and secrete. You found it. It's never too soon to review for the final exam. So sometimes I ask these questions and you might feel like, wait, didn't we already have a test over that? Am I not allowed to forget that? No, you are not allowed to forget that. So the whole central canal, I'm going to make some cilia because they've got cilia too. The whole central canal is lined by these simple cuboidal, sometimes they might look a little simple columnar cells. You'll see this in lab. And they secrete the CSF that flows through the central canal. They can kind of make and secrete that CSF in that canal. Anyway, that was fun. I enjoyed that. Okay. Horns and columns, we kind of talked about that a little bit. The horns are the gray matter, which would contain mostly soma and dendrites. This is at the very bottom, 168. I wanted you guys to make sure you got these answers. Columns would, as I already said, white matter, which consists of just myelinated axons. Oh, I can do that on my drawing, though. Yeah, let's do this. Top of page 169. Let's add some stuff. Let's just draw it right on here. So, on the right side of your spinal cord, on the right side of the spinal cord sketch, diagram a spinal nerve, ventral root, dorsal root, and the dorsal root ganglion. I can do that. Yeah, I'm going to show you how to do that. Now, coming out of the anterior, so let me put my labels back on. Anterior, which is also known as ventral. So this gets a bit confusing if you haven't practiced the directional terminology in a while. Okay. And like just about everything in anatomy, there's more than one name for everything, right? So crazy. So on the anterior side, also known as the ventral side, there's a nerve root that comes out here, and it's basically just a bundle of axons coming out, and it's going to kind of curl around this direction. And it is going to meet with a dorsal root that curls around this way. But that dorsal root has like an extra little something here. It's got a little extra something on it. Got a little extra on it. And they merge together. All right? Now, let me see if I can kind of... Where they have merged together right out here, that would be called a spinal nerve. Okay, that is officially a spinal nerve. These other two things that are coming together, forming this kind of sideways V shape, are nerve roots. And so this one down here is referred to as the ventral root. Okay, and this one over here is known as the dorsal root. And the enlargement that's only on the dorsal root, I hope my artwork does it justice, but that enlargement that's only on the dorsal root is referred to as the dorsal root ganglion. Dorsal root ganglion, that enlargement. The reason why it's like that is because it contains all the cell bodies of these unipolar neurons. I'll just sketch like maybe 4 of them, but there are millions of them in every dorsal root. Of these sensory neurons, unipolar neurons, that are bringing their impulses into the spinal cord. I'll draw some arrows to show the direction. Remember, action potentials only travel in one direction. So these are sensory or afferent because they're coming in from the periphery into the spinal cord. And so they will, their cell bodies are located in the dorsal root ganglion. All right, so here's a bunch of other ones here. I won't draw their whole axons coming in. All right, so all sensory input into the spinal cord comes in through the spinal nerve, but then it splits and goes only through the dorsal root ganglion. Only through the dorsal root. The ventral root is motor only, and it consists of axons. I kind of try to draw a cell body of a single axon. Let's make it dark purple little nucleus right there. That doesn't show up very well. Let's make it a little darker. There we go. So there's the nucleus of a multipolar. Now remember, the sensory ones are unipolar. Of this multipolar motor neuron whose axon is now going out of the spinal cord by way of the ventral root. Okay, now these pathways will eventually join together so that the spinal nerve is mixed. Again, the nerve itself, just like we said a few slides ago, the nerve itself contains both sensory and motor, right? But the roots are, the ventral root is motor only, okay? And the dorsal root, is sensory only, all right? Where is the cell body of the sensory unipolar neuron? Dorsal root ganglion. What is the definition of a ganglion? Cluster of cell bodies outside the central nervous system. See, once you cross that line right there, you're in the CNS, or going this way, you're out of the CNS once you cross that line right down there. Okay, so this is a cluster of cell bodies. If this is a cluster of cell bodies right here, this DRG, what kind of matter would it be? Gray or white? Would it be gray matter or white matter if you look at a cross section of that dorsal root ganglion? Gray matter or white matter? It's going to be gray. Yeah, it's going to be mostly gray matter. There will be some axons coming through there, but it's going to have a lot of soma. There's not really any dendrites. Your fingertips or your toe tips or the skin of your knee or your elbow, wherever those dendrites are located in your skin, where they're bringing back sensory information from the surface of your body. But it would be more gray matter in that dorsal root ganglion. Yeah. Where are the cell bodies of the motor neurons? Where are the cell bodies of the motor neurons? What did we say this big gray lump was called? What's this big gray lump? Right here. This contains the cell bodies of the motor neurons in the spinal cord. What's this big gray area right here called? That's the AGH. Yeah, the anterior gray horn. Next couple of questions and we'll move on. Do sensory impulses always enter the posterior side of the spinal cord? Yes. Do motor impulses always exit the ventral side of the spinal cord? Yes. Those are easy. I just wanted to see how easy those were. That's just the way the spinal cord is set up. Okay? But here's how you're going to have a question on the test. And so here again, potential test question alert. Make sure that wakes everybody up. Everybody awake? Everybody awake? Potential test question alert, everybody. Okay, all right, good. 2 possible questions. You probably won't see both of them, but there's 2 variations. If a patient comes to the hospital with a severed spinal nerve, which of the following functions will they lose? Sensory function, motor function, both sensory and motor, or neither one? The question is asking if the patient, I'll give you a second to think about it, a severed spinal nerve, will the patient lose sensory, motor, both, or neither? Yeah, you guys got it, both, right? Yep. Here's why, guys. Check it out over here in the upper left. That's the one key word in that question. That's the one key word. Because nerves, spinal nerves, are always mixed. What if the question says the patient has cut or severed several ventral nerve roots? Several ventral nerve roots. Which will they lose? Sensory, motor, both, or neither? You got it. Motor only. If it says dorsal roots, it would be sensory only. Okay? But those are several different arrangements of questions about this kind of info on this page. Okay? Any questions about those questions? Looks like I woke you guys up with my test question alert. A lot of people typed answers. Good. Got your attention. Review of sensory input. Sensory neuron in the peripheral nervous system is afferent. It brings impulses to the spinal cord, so you can just circle afferent. Our sensory neurons in the peripheral nervous system are all sensory neurons in the peripheral nervous system afferent? Yes. The cell body of the sensory neuron is located in the dorsal root ganglion. That's that blank that's about midway down page 169, DRG. Hopefully you filled that in. And same is true for some of the motor stuff. Where is the cell body, perikaryon, soma, of the motor neuron located? It's located in the anterior gray horn. Anterior gray horn, that's that first question under big letter D. Anterior gray horn. How does the brain send impulses to the motor neuron in the anterior gray horn? We're going to look at that next. Don't you worry about that one. We're going to get to that. How does the motor axon leave the spinal cord? Through the ventral root. Ventral root. Where does the motor axon go once it leaves the spinal cord? Well, it merges with the dorsal root and becomes the spinal nerve. Then it goes, from there, it's going to go to where? This soma, right here, that soma, is the cell body of a single axon that's going to go all the way to where? Where is this going to go? We've talked about it. Yeah, where specifically on skeletal muscles? Where will we see it? Going all the way back to chapter 9. Where will it end? Where will it end? just again, kind of reviewing for the final exam. Where will it end? It'll end at axon terminals that meet a motor end plate of a skeletal muscle. And what's that area called? What kind of a synapse is that? Neuromuscular junction is what I assume Tanya was trying to type. Neuromuscular junctio. I know what you mean. I got you. I got you covered. NMJ, neuromuscular. You're fine. I knew what you were saying. But you got it. Tanya was kind of the first one to sort of get the idea I was driving at. Literally, let me use my little pointer finger again. Literally, this soma, cell body in the anterior gray horn of the spinal cord, has a single axon that will continuously go all the way out to that neuromuscular junction, where it will, as you guys correctly also said, where it will innervate and excite a skeletal muscle at that motor end plate, releasing acetylcholine. So this very same cell I've drawn right here in the spinal cord is the one that makes acetylcholine, mostly makes it right here in the cell body, and then slowly exports it. It literally can take, guys, it can literally take days for acetylcholine to transport all the way out to the axon terminal. In the case of the longest motor neurons you have, go from about the level of your diaphragm in your spinal cord. The end of your spinal cord is about the same level as your diaphragm, all the way down to the muscles in your feet that kind of help to move your toes back and forth, side to side, as much as you can. Those are the longest motor neurons you have in your body. For some very, very tall people, that's almost a meter long. Shorter people, it's about 3/4 of a meter. That's, that's a long single cell. Okay? So that one that I skipped, how does the brain send impulses to a motor neuron in the anterior gray horn? That's where we get into studying these things called tracts. Now, I added this over here because this is the much nicer, more artistic version of the diagram that's in your lecture notes that we labeled, but you can see if you've got a copy of the textbook, this is a little bit, nicer version, but it's got all the parts here, and all the parts are labeled. There's the ventral root, there's the dorsal root, there's the dorsal root ganglion. They merge together to form the spinal nerve, which isn't really illustrated here. But now we get to how the brain gets info from the spinal cord or sends info down the spinal cord, action potentials up or down. First ones we're going to look at are called the sensory tracts. So is sensory in the spinal cord? It is afferent, but sensory in the spinal cord, is it ascending or descending? Sensory. It's afferent, still afferent, afferent. Yeah, it's ascending. These are, like look way down here in the bottom of this diagram, a sensation of pain, getting burned on your toe. You need that information to ascend up the spinal cord, up to the brain, the primary somatosensory cortex. Do you see that way up there? Where is that primary somatosensory cortex? What part, what lobe, what gyrus is that sensory cortex located on? Post-central gyrus, good. What lobe of the brain would that be in? The post-central gyrus would be part of which of the 4 major lobes? Nice, you're on it. You're typing fast today, Dongsil. Yeah, parietal lobe. Yeah, so that's what we're looking at kind of in a frontal section here. This gray matter, remember we talked last week about this little bit of gray matter called the cerebral cortex. Since it's sensory ascending, that information is going to what's called the primary somatosensory cortex, but specifically that is located in the postcentral gyrus, which is a part of the parietal lobe. Good. Wanted to kind of refresh that again. All right, so these are the tracts called the ascending tracts. They carry information to the brain. In which part of the spinal cord are they found? They are found mostly in the lateral and posterior columns, primarily in this textbook calls them the dorsal columns. You can see the dorsal columns. But again, we kind of have to practice our dorsal posterior columns, because see over here on the far left, it's calling them the posterior white columns. So you kind of have to go back and forth with the posterior dorsal and the ventral anterior. You get a lot of practice going back and forth. So in which part of the spinal cord tracts are the spinal cord, in which part of the spinal cord are tracts found? White matter. How are they named? Mostly they are named by starting point. Well, let's just do it this way. Let's just say they are mostly named start, end. Start, end. Okay? So, look at the question just below that. Where does the spinothalamic tract begin and end? Okay? This is not a trick question. In its name, it tells us, and this is the one that's pictured way over here in the bottom right too, the spinothalamic pathway or the spinothalamic tract. It starts spinal cord, ends where? Where does it end? In the thalamus. It ends in the thalamus. So let's check it out. Let's follow this one. So here's the sensory neuron itself that's actually feeling the pain of getting burned on your foot or your hand or wherever. And these little temperature receptors, those are the dendrites. And they will send action potentials through the spinal nerve that will then split. Since it's sensory, it's going to come into the dorsal root, the cell body, perikaryon, the soma of that sensory neuron in the dorsal root ganglion, but it just blows right on past it. It doesn't even stop. The impulse just goes shoo and shoots right past it in through the posterior root or the dorsal root where it synapses. That's what that little symbol means. It's kind of tiny, but that's the end of that actual sensory neuron that brought the message of pain to the spinal cord. Then it synapses with this second neuron that's called it's literally called the second order neuron. So the second neuron begins in the spinal cord. It starts down here in the spinal cord. And it's going to cross over, because remember, if this is your left foot, the sensation is going to have to go to the right side of your brain. So it's going to cross over, and this one tract is going to enter this lateral white column, and it's going to go up, 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 and then it ends right there at the thalamus. It doesn't actually make it all the way to the cortex, because remember, we talked about the thalamus last week too. It's your major sensory relay point that's going to make sure the signal gets to the right place. Because this is the spot of the brain that says, you burned your foot. If the signal went to the wrong place, it would say, even though you burned your foot, your brain would get the message that, oh, you burned your cheek, or you burned your hand, or you burned your shoulder. So the thalamus's job is to make sure that the signal gets to the right location so you get the right perception of what happened. Your brain understands what happened to your body, if all of that makes a little bit of sense. You don't have to understand the details of how that network works, but that's literally how you're wired up. That's how your body is wired to receive that impulse. So that tract is called a spinothalamic tract. All right. What about one that I don't have? Yeah, I do. Here's one over here. check this one out. This one's coming from like a muscle spindle fiber, which is one of your proprioceptors. It measures the stretch of your muscles, and it's just going to send little low-frequency impulses to the spinal cord. It's still sensory because it's coming into the spinal cord, and it stops right there. And a new one begins in the spinal cord and goes up the lateral columns to the cerebellum. So that one is referred to as starting in the spinal cord, ending in the cerebellum. So it's called the spinocerebellar pathway. All right? And I just want you guys to be aware, the ones that are mentioned in your lecture notes, I have seen those as questions, usually multiple choice questions, not too many of them, maybe one or two on past tests that would say something like a multiple choice question. Which of the following would be the term for a sensory pathway that begins in the spinal cord and ends in the thalamus? And they'll give you a bunch of names, but you're going to pick spinothalamic. All right. So the naming, these names look big and complicated, but we're gonna focus on asking you about the ones that have clear start and end points in their names. Okay. Are the tracts in any special order in the spinal cord? Yeah, they are in a particular order. The order of them determines where they end up specifically in the brain. We'll talk about that more in the next chapter when we talk about the networks. Sensory tracts, impulses to the brain. Yes, motor tracts. Let's look at the motor tracts. Let's see. I think I got motor tracts on this next one. Don't be too concerned about the specific ones. We'll talk about them in the next chapter. Motor tracts are they ascending or descending? All right, so motor tracts are definitely efferent, but within the brain and spinal cord, they would be sending impulses from the brain down to the spinal cord. Yes, so they're descending tracts. They are mostly located in the anterior white columns, the anterior columns. And in fact, they're really kind of bloated in the front of the medulla oblongata. We kind of talked about this a little bit last week, that at the front of the medulla, these two big, thick ridges that consist of literally hundreds of millions of axons, myelinated axons, moving down through the pons, and the vast majority of them actually cross over at the medulla before you even get to the spinal cord. That's looking pretty messy, isn't it? But they cross at the medulla at what's known as the decussation of the pyramids. Those ridges are called the pyramids, and where they cross over, the word decussation is just a big, complicated word for crossing. And that's where the motor neurons may start over on the left side of your brain, but end up controlling skeletal muscles on the right side of your body, because most of them, not all of them, as you can see, cross over at the medulla. Those that do not cross at the medulla follow this one. This one here does not cross at the medulla, but it does cross at the spot where it's getting ready to leave the spinal cord and go out to the muscle. So even though this neuron way back up here starts on the right side of the cortex, in the primary motor cortex, it starts on the right side of the brain, it's still going to control muscles on the left side. What is the term, just to review, that we use for talking about how the brain controls the opposite side of the body, or feels the opposite side of the body? What's the word for opposite side? Yeah, contralateral. Contralateral. Where is this motor cortex on the brain? What gyrus is that motor cortex on? That gyrus is the what gyrus? Which one is that one? If the sensory is the postcentral. Yeah, the motor is the precentral gyrus. The motor is the precentral gyrus. Notice, this is the thalamus. Nothing passes through the thalamus. The thalamus is sensory only. The sensory. I'm more likely to give you more credit for typing it in fast, getting it in there fast. I am definitely not judging. On your exams, I do have to grade the spelling, and if it's too bad, I sometimes have to take off partial credit if it's too bad, but I can still give you some partial credit. But in this environment, I can just be myself and not judge. Notice how it takes 2 neurons to get to the pathway. Your gyri are absolutely fine. Way to go. Way to get your vaccine. So notice how there's 2. Here's the cell body way up here in the brain that starts the action potential that goes down right there. And it goes all the way down the spinal cord, and then it crosses over. And that's the spot that we looked at on our diagram back on page when I was doing the drawing on page 168. That's the specific spot right there where that soma starts in the anterior gray horn, and its axon goes out through the anterior or ventral root, and that one cell's axon will go all the way out to the neuromuscular junction of the skeletal muscle, no matter how far it has to go, even if it has to go from your lumbar spinal cord all the way down to your toes. That's how far it'll go. But that means we end up with 2 neurons in a sequence needed to get the signal to this muscle right here. So to get the signal to that muscle right there, let's rewind it back here. There's 1 neuron that leaves the spinal cord and goes to the neuromuscular junction. But it starts low down in the spinal cord at whatever level, in this case maybe the lumbar region of the spinal cord. It could be cervical or thoracic too. But whatever level it needs to come out to get to that muscle, it starts right there. And it is in a synapse with this other neuron. And its cell body starts all the way up here in your cerebral cortex. Those are those pyramidal cells that we talked about last week that are, if you look at them under the microscope, they kind of have this kind of vaguely triangular sort of a shape with the little dendrites that reach up out into the cortex and reach out and connect to each other. And then at this point right here, they have a single axon that just winds its way all the way down to your spinal cord. And it's going to have little axon terminals where way down in the spinal cord, it's going to synapse with a multipolar neuron that leaves the spinal cord and goes out to the neuromuscular junction to activate that muscle. So we have 2 neurons in the pathway called an upper motor neuron, and this one down here that leaves the spinal cord called the lower motor neuron. That lower motor neuron is mostly within the nerve that goes to the muscle. So when you want to flex for example, if you want to flex your deltoid on your shoulder, the nerve that goes to that muscle is called the axillary nerve, and that nerve is a bundle of tens of thousands of axons that are really mostly just lower motor neurons coming from the spinal cord to the various different muscle fibers of that deltoid muscle. And that's true for every skeletal muscle. So if somebody severs their upper motor neurons, those are really mostly in the spinal cord. Those upper motor neurons are either in the brain stem or in the spinal cord. And so that would be what we would call like severing the spinal cord. But if you look at my crazy all over the place diagram here, you'll see that the neuron going from the spinal cord to the muscle is still in place. It's still intact. It hasn't been severed. And it can sometimes still send impulses to the muscle, causing the muscle to spasm, muscle spasms. And you don't have brain control over that muscle anymore. You can't control that muscle if your patient can't. If you've severed the spinal cord or severed any of the upper motor neurons, you don't have conscious control over that muscle. But these neurons down in the spinal cord going out to the muscle, they can still send random impulses that can cause muscle spasms. So it's called paralysis because you don't have conscious control of the muscle. But it's called spastic paralysis because the muscles can still spasm because there's still an intact neuron going from the spinal cord to the muscle. On the other hand, if the upper motor neurons are still intact, let's kind of sketch over them. They're still there, they're still good. But you cut a nerve. You cut the nerve. And you cut off the flow from the spinal cord to the muscle. Again, just like with the other paralysis, you no longer have conscious control of that muscle. But there's no nerve signal at all going to the muscle anymore. And so the muscle cannot spasm or anything. It's completely flaccid, which is another word for it's soft and unresponsive. So it's called flaccid paralysis. Flaccid paralysis. Okay? So, and this is a lot of this stuff that I'm taking so much time going over is stuff that's just repetitious in the next chapter. So you'll see we won't have to talk about it twice once we get to the next chapter. Plexuses. So when those nerves like I was talking about just over here, that on the previous slide, that go out from the spinal cord, that come out of the spinal cord, these spinal nerves, they don't usually, some of them do. These thoracic nerves go straight to their targets. They come out and they go straight to their muscle targets. Those are called the intercostal nerves, and they're coming out of the thoracic region. But all the other regions, the nerves don't just come straight out. They intermingle and mix with each other. They sort of, fibers from different ones kind of mix with fibers from others, and they kind of intermingle and interweave. So the thoracic region is the only one that doesn't form these complexes called plexuses. So for each one, you can see I've got some notes here. What you need to know about each one is just what we would consider kind of the bare basics of each plexus. There are 4 of them. Cervical plexus, brachial plexus. I'll kind of circle them so you can see where they are. The cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, nothing in the thoracic region, the lumbar plexus, and the sacral plexus. So for those 4, we want you to know the name, which I just circled, cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral. Know some of the major nerves that come from that plexus, and what are the groups of spinal nerves that form the plexus. I think as I talk through it on the next few slides, I hope it'll make a little sense. Oh, also while I'm at it, way better diagram here from your textbook than the one I tried to draw earlier in class of the cervical enlargement, and then the spinal cord gets narrow through the thoracic region, and then it gets pudgier at the lumbar region called the lumbar enlargement. Okay. So again, the lumbar enlargement is bigger because it's got these nerves that are going to go down to your legs. Cervical enlargement is bigger because it's got the cell bodies of all those motor neurons that are headed out to your shoulders and arms. Okay. So right from the start, here's the first plexus to know. And you can see I've got all the basic information that you need to know right there. It's called the cervical plexus. It's made of spinal nerves C1 through C5. Okay, so cervical spinal nerve 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. They sort of blend together to form these nerves. This is the plexus, this kind of mess, this intersection in between. This is the plexus. And what comes out beyond it are the nerves of the plexus. Now, these are all the nerves that come from that plexus. This is the only one you need to know, called the phrenic nerve. I've heard it pronounced the phrenic nerve, which is fine too. Phrenic nerve. That's the way I learned how to pronounce it. Every time, I'll give you a little clue. Every time you see the word phrenic, it's always referring to the same body organ. Does anybody know what organ the word phrenic refers to? Like the word renal refers to kidney, hepatic refers to liver, phrenic refers to what? Anybody? No? Well, all right. See, so I used to, oh, Tanya got it. But again, Tanya, you left out a crucial letter. Diaphragm. Diaphragm. It's not pronounced. The G is silent. The G. But you got the organ right. The diaphragm. Every time you guys see the word phrenic, it always has something to do with the diaphragm. Right? So you will later, many of you will later learn about the blood vessels and nerves that go to the diaphragm. And those will all have something like the anterior phrenic artery, the posterior phrenic artery, stuff like that. But the phrenic nerves are the nerves that come from your neck. And you can't even see the whole thing. Let me try to sketch it. They use yellow for nerves. This phrenic nerve over here in this diagram is going to go all the way down. It's shown kind of cut off. And it's going to go all the way down, and it's going to innervate half of the diaphragm. And guess what? There's another phrenic nerve over here on this side. You have two phrenic nerves. So your diaphragm is innervated by two separate phrenic nerves. And what is the clinical significance about the fact that this phrenic nerve comes from so high up in your neck and to go all the way down to the diaphragm? Why don't we just have nerves from way down here in the thoracic region that just go straight out to the diaphragm? Well, what if a terrible thing happens and somebody severs, they have a terrible accident and they sever their spinal cord at like the C7, C8 region? Nothing from there down will work anymore. But what can still work? Because the phrenic nerve comes out up at C4, C5. What can still work even if you sever the spinal cord that high up? The diaphragm. The diaphragm can still get innervated, so people can still breathe. Even if you've severed the spinal cord, you can be quadriplegic. Yeah, you can be quadriplegic and still have a functioning diaphragm. All right, let's look at the next plexus. This one's called the brachial plexus. Remember, the word brachial means arm, so this one consists of nerves that go out to the shoulder and arm. It originates with C5 through T1, cervical 5 through thoracic 1. So that's cervical 5, cervical 6, cervical 7, and actually cervical 8. There are only 7 cervical vertebrae, but there are 8 cervical nerves, and then T1 nerves. So all of these together make up that brachial plexus. The 5 major nerves we want you to know are the axillary nerve, which primarily goes to, that was the one I mentioned a little while ago, it goes to the deltoid muscle on your shoulder. The musculocutaneous nerve, which does mostly the anterior arm. And remember, arm is the term for the shoulder to the elbow. Shoulder to the elbow. Sometimes people call it the upper arm, but in anatomy, we just use the word arm for the shoulder to the elbow. What's the elbow to wrist called? If arm is shoulder to elbow, what's elbow to wrist? What's the term for elbow to wrist for that whole area? The radial is the bone, or on that side, but what's this whole part from your elbow all the way to your wrist, the whole thing that includes the radius and the, it's called a forearm. It's referred to as a forearm. Forearm. So from there to there is called forearm, and from shoulder to elbow is technically called the arm. And the reason I mention that is because I think outside of anatomy, in just like general, just to the general public, people think of their arm as like the whole thing, and their hand is at the end of their arm. In anatomy, arm is just shoulder to elbow. Forearm is elbow to wrist. Okay, so when I say musculocutaneous nerve innervates the muscles of the anterior arm, that would mostly be your biceps brachii, brachialis, coracobrachialis, those muscles on the front of what most people would call their upper arm, just your upper arm, flexors of the elbow. All right, the radial nerve mostly does posterior upper limb, which includes arm and forearm. So really all the muscles down the backside, so that triceps brachii on the posterior of your arm, as well as the extensors on the posterior of your forearm. That's the radial nerve. The ulnar nerve and the median nerve both kind of share the anterior forearm muscles. That's kind of a good way to kind of generalize the function of all of those nerves. Okay. Then the lumbar plexus and sacral plexus, these are big, massive, they have a lot going on, but we don't want you to know a whole lot about them. Just lumbar plexus, L1 through L4, lumbar 1 through lumbar 4. The major nerve that comes out of the lumbar plexus is called the femoral nerve. The femoral nerve, that's the major important nerve of the lumbar plexus. And it primarily supplies the muscles of the anterior thigh. The anterior thigh. Okay, so those muscles, what we sometimes call your quadriceps, as well as the muscle called the sartorius across the front of the thigh. Those are the major muscles that are innervated by the femoral nerve. Those muscles are your major knee extensors. So if we have a patient or a client sitting on the examination table and we ask them to kind of raise their foot up in the air, kind of like to kick their foot up in the air, and if there's weakness in being able to lift or kick the foot up in the air like that, we might suspect that there's a problem with the femoral nerve. The sacral nerve, an important nerve of this plexus, like the major important nerve of this L4, S4 plexus, is the sciatic nerve. It's the major one. And it supplies muscles of the whole posterior lower limb. So that would be posterior thigh, and really most of the muscles of what we call the leg. In our book, we call it the lower leg. Again, in anatomy, the region from your hip to your knee is called the thigh or femoral region. And from your knee to your ankle is officially called the leg. It's technically referred to as the sura in Latin, or the leg. So we don't use those terms much in our lecture notes. We call it upper leg and lower leg. But officially the lower leg is technically just called the leg. Thigh and leg. Okay, which I am very familiar with because those are two of my favorite pieces of fried chicken. The thigh and the leg. Yeah, I mean, except if we were still in A&P 1, we would have to be super specific about it. The pudendal nerve innervates muscles involved in sexual activity and continence. So the pudendal nerve is it innervates structures in the groin region. And it does innervate sexual excitement, but more often, if there's damage to it, it shows up as incontinence, inability to hold your urine until you get to the bathroom, or even hold your feces before getting to the bathroom. So incontinence is often usually the first sign that there's damage to the pudendal nerve. Okay. All right. Dermatome is an area of the skin supplied by a specific spinal nerve. Diagnostically very helpful because you can look at a particular area, like if a patient has numbness or tingling over the back of their forearm, extending down to their index finger. You can look at a dermatome map and say, oh, you might have pinched your C7 nerve all the way up here in your spinal cord, in your neck. But if the symptoms are only along this little map, along this little part of your skin, the numbness and tingling or the pain is just on that part of your skin, then we can, the map, the dermatome is a map that helps us, or the dermatome map, I should say, helps us tell exactly where the injury might be. The dermatome itself is the area of the skin, and we can look at the map of the dermatomes to help figure out exactly where the injury might be in the spinal cord. Typically, the darn virus, varicella zoster virus, we sometimes call it the VZV. Varicella zoster virus is most famously known as the chickenpox virus. It's a type of herpes virus, actually. It's just the class that it belongs to. Herpes is a class of virus, not specifically a disease. And it's a kind of a DNA herpes virus that causes chickenpox. But if you've ever had the chickenpox, you didn't actually really get rid of the virus. The virus hides in nerves that follow these dermatome patterns. And you can see, I'll kind of sketch a couple of the dermatomes right along here on this patient, just at and just below the navel. So if you take a look at our dermatome map, on the anterior side of our dermatome map, you can actually see that probably the spinal nerves T9 and T10 are the nerves that the virus was hiding out in all those years until this patient became immunocompromised, and the virus was able to reemerge again, to come back out and cause a reemergence of the chickenpox. But because it erupts from the nerves, the first time the chickenpox virus doesn't come from the nerves. It kind of enters the bloodstream, and so it can appear all over the skin. But when your immune system starts to get the chickenpox under control, the virus begins to get into the nerves, and when it comes back out again, it follows these dermatome patterns, and it erupts from nerves, which is extremely painful. So this reappearance is called the shingles, and it is far more painful because they pop out of the nerves and cause nerve damage, not permanent nerve damage, but painful nerve damage temporarily. And that nerve damage is extremely, extremely painful. All right, let's take a short break until